Hello there, this is John with Gringo.dev reporting live from Ciudad de Mexico, which is what makes me the gringo. But today I want to talk about continuous integration, continuous deployment, and how you can achieve that with GitHub Actions in a Laravel context. And so this project that we're building on this channel is called the Stoic Developer, of course, this series. It is a Laravel and Livewire project that shows you how to build a podcast application. And so as part of that, I thought it would be useful to set up a CI/CD environment that you can use to run test automation and perhaps adapt to your own project. And so to unpack that for a second, the basic idea behind CI or continuous integration is that you have a set of tests, automated tests that you can run continuously, hence continuous, as part of your software development process. And so anytime that you open a PR or check-in code or really any event that you configure, typically using GitHub Actions, you run your test suite. If everything passes, then you can go on to deploy that, again, continuously to your production environment. And so that's the CI/CD terminology there. In terms of why it matters, I think it's largely just a contrast to the way that things used to be done. So for context, I used to be at LinkedIn before the IPO, long time ago. But I remember there, not to pick on LinkedIn, this is just kind of how stuff used to work. But, they had a large QA team and they even had a central QA team. And the basic process was you as a developer would check in your code to a specific branch that was designated for a specific release. And so this is something that required, at some point, months of planning to get new code out the door. And so your QA resource or resources would test your changes. If everything looked good, that would get merged into the release branch. Then the QA team would almost have this sort of negotiation process of, okay, yes, this is a bug, but is it really a showstopper? And kind of arrive at an agreement about when that branch was ready to release. And then when central QA gave its blessing, then they would have another team that was large that would do this very complicated build, ultimately resulting in an artifact that would get deployed to actual physical machines in a data center, which, like I said, this is a long time ago. And today we have much better tools for doing that kind of stuff. You can spin up a GitHub action, which is essentially just a VM in your repo. That's one way to think about it. And every time, like really whatever events you want, but typically if you open a PR or check-in code or both, you will run your tests to make sure that nothing is broken. And then if all of those tests pass, you will deploy your code to your production environment. So in our case, the production environment is something called Railway, which I covered in the previous video. Railway actually makes it easy to just say, okay, if and only if all of these tests pass, do I want my code to go live to my users? And, all of it's pretty seamless. So what I'm going to show you is a GitHub action that I created for this project. It's probably a good starting point for you guys if you want to adapt it to your own project, although it should pretty much work out of box, at least if you're using the same stack that I am. With minimal tweaks if you're using another Laravel project with maybe a different database or something like that. So I'm going to leave a link to that file in the video description. Feel free to check it out and give me any feedback, comments, questions, that sort of thing. So then also just separately to talk about testing in general and just a philosophical point there, but it's become kind of popular or trendy, I guess, for people to say, oh, I don't write tests, like they slow me down, like all of this stuff. And respectfully, I just disagree with that perspective. I think you should be writing tests. Don't get me wrong. I think probably as a business owner, especially, like it's in your interest to also just verify like manually at times that things work and look the way that you expect them to. But as a developer, you don't want to have to test every single part of your site every time that you make a change. And so for me, it's one of those like classical slow down a little bit to go much faster kind of things. Even when I'm just building for myself, having like a rudimentary test suite, at least like maybe just some feature or a couple of integration tests to verify that like the happy path flows that I have in my app are still working. And like something over here didn't break because I did something over here is just immensely useful. And it's like, I can't even imagine developing without that. So yeah, I don't really buy into that take. I frankly think that a lot of people say stuff like that just because they're trying to get engagement on YouTube or Twitter or what have you, which luckily with me is not an issue. Like I built this channel basically to entertain myself and hopefully educate, especially younger engineers who I think are influenced by a lot of paid sponsorships and stuff that happen on YouTube and, other social media. And, with that goal in mind, if you wouldn't mind giving me a like or a subscribe, that would be great. If you don't, that's also great. Like I didn't start this channel to make any money, so I guess it's all the same ultimately, but I get a little bit more motivated when people like my stuff. So anyway, with that out of the way, let's get into it. All right. And before we get into code, I wanted to go through a tool that I used for developing this, and I think it's amazing. And I wish more people knew about it. But if you've ever built a GitHub action before, you probably have had the experience of doing like, I don't know, 60 commits into your repo, trying to find the magical incantation that will get GitHub to run the stuff that you want. And it's usually some environment variable that's wrong or like whatever, right? So if you plan on editing this or whatever, I think this is a good tool to use, Necto Act on GitHub, and it's basically a way of running GitHub Actions locally on your machine. And so they have instructions in this repo on how to install it and all of that. I'm not going to go through it, uh, like not in detail anyway. But yeah, you brew install it. One note: if you're on an Apple Silicon Mac, you should run it with AMD 64 flag. That's just saying, run it like it's actually a Linux container, just for better compatibility with the environment you'll actually have on GitHub. But this lets you try your actions locally without having to pollute your commit history so much with so many attempts to get stuff right. And it's typically a much faster iterative cycle as well. So just a quick note on this, like, of course, I'm going to give you an action that if it works for you, you can just install directly into your repo. But if you want to tweak it, edit it, you'd like to start building your own, this is a great tool to have in your tool belt. All right, so we're going to flip over to PHP Storm and check out what we got going here. So I actually have my job running locally here in my terminal. Um, so you can see this is the command. We're running act, the tool I mentioned earlier. We're giving it the job name, which is Laravel test in the file. And then we're telling it, because I am on an Apple Silicon Mac, we're telling it to use this container architecture so we have better compatibility with the job that we're going to be running in GitHub's environment. If you're not on Apple Silicon, you probably don't have to do that. But in any case, you can see that it's going to go through here and run all the steps in the job. We're just going to let that run while we talk through the other stuff. And so if we flip over here to runtests.yaml, this is the job definition right here. So you can see that we listen to a couple of events. One is a push into the main branch, and the other is a PR against the main branch. And so if either of those two things happen, the rest of the job is going to run. Here we have a service. So basically, if you were doing a Docker Compose, like this would be another service that you're spinning up effectively to talk to. And so here we're doing Postgres with some environment set up so that we have a known user password and database name in advance, along with a port. And then that becomes something. So again, keep in mind, you're basically spinning up Docker containers as part of your GitHub action. So the same way that you would have a container for your database if you were using Docker locally, you're going to have one in your GitHub action as well. And so you would communicate with the same way. And the rest of your job is also its own Docker container that can communicate to these other services, much like you would if you were using Docker Compose locally. So with that in mind, the first thing you have to do is check out your code so that you have the code in your file system inside the container. Nothing new there. I'll dwell on this for a second. So you'll notice that I'm copying this .env.ci.example file that I'm adding to .env. That's a preference. You could set up your environment directly inside this file. I just think it's cleaner to have a separate file and just make it very clear what your CI environment is. You're going to have to configure that environment somewhere, and I think it's just, like I said, cleaner to have it somewhere else. So not too much here. I mean, you're basically going to configure this environment the same way you would when you're running tests locally. But the difference is you just need to adjust your database connection here to match the stuff that you set up over here. And so, if you want to just use this the same way I have it, it'll just work. If you wanted to switch this to be MySQL or something like that and just update the connection details, you can do that too. But pretty straightforward. And you'll notice here that we're doing something insecure, which is setting a key and checking it into the repo. It's actually not really insecure in this case because we're only using this key, which is used for encryption and stuff, in the context of CI. And of course, that's not actually running in production, doesn't have access to any of your production data, et cetera. So in this case, checking in this key is fine. Just make sure that it's a different key from the one that you were using in environments that actually matter. And Laravel has a command for generating the key. So just generate a new one and put it in here. It's fine. So after that, we do some normal stuff. You're going to set up PHP in your environment here. In this case, we're using 8.2, so we set it to 8.2. Any extensions that you need to run your code, you'll want to set up here as well. At a minimum, you're going to want the extension to talk to your database, which in this case is Postgres. And then you install your dependencies. So Composer, npm, run your build for npm2 because you'll get an error if you don't. Run your database migrations. And this is kind of the moment of truth where you know if you've configured everything correctly. This is the first part that will typically error out if an environment variable is wrong. And then you actually run your tests using the normal Laravel command. And let's see if that all worked correctly. So you can see it's going through all of these steps locally. Act is great because if it works here, it's very likely going to work in GitHub as well. If I go all the way to the bottom, you can see that my job succeeded. So we have tests that are running. So we're going to check that in, make sure that it works the way that we think it does inside the repo. And then we will show how to configure Railway to verify that all these tests have passed before our code goes live. And actually, one more note before I move on. So you notice here I have this move command to rename my .m file. That is strictly in your local environment. If you don't change it to something else, Laravel is going to pick up this .m file by default, and then it's going to override the stuff that you copied in as part of your job. And so just temporarily rename that when you're testing locally so you don't get errors that seem strange or whatever. Like, I thought I set my variable over there in the other file and all of that stuff. And then as soon as you're done testing your job locally, you can rename this back to .env so that you can do stuff normally. But just a note there, you don't have to do that in the actual GitHub action. All right, and if you look at my GitHub repo here, which again is gringo.dev Stoic podcast, feel free to star it if you would like to follow along. But you can go into the GitHub job here, and you can see that all of the steps that we set up here are running. And just to dig into the artisan test one, you can see that it's running all of the tests that we have in our project, and they are passing. And then upon passage of that suite, then Railway, it waits, and then once everything passes, it deploys the code. So we're going to show you how to turn that on next. All right, so flipping over to Railway here, you'll notice that we're back in our Stoic Developer project. And so gating release on the successful passing of tests is actually as simple as just checking this box here. So enable check suites, and then basically Railway is going to look at all of your jobs that run against the particular deployment branch that you have set up here, which in this case is main. And if and only if all of those actions pass, will it go on to release your code. So rather than having to do all of that inside the action, if you're using Railway, you just flip this switch and you are good to go. All right, so there you have it, a continuous integration test suite that will run your test automation anytime you open a PR against main or commit code to main in your GitHub repo. So I hope that was helpful. Good jumping off point anyway. If you want to do something a little bit different, like tweaks or whatever, leave me a comment. I'm happy to take a look at whatever you are trying to do and give my thoughts. And, aside from that, just remember, kids, only you can prevent production fires with test. So if you guys found this helpful, please leave me a like, please leave me a subscribe, and I will see you guys next time. Take care.